It was the kind of morning that could have belonged to any other in the world. Except, of course, it wasn't. The sun hung heavy over Hawthorne Boulevard, casting long shadows over SpaceX's headquarters. The gleaming glass buildings towered against a canvas of pale blue sky, reflecting the city's ambition, its hunger for progress. And if you looked hard enough, its hidden cracks. The streets bustled with the usual rhythm. People darting in and out of their cars, clicking heels on the pavement, the faint hum of industry vibrating beneath every conversation. But all of it felt oddly muted today, as if the city was holding its breath. Inside the sleek, high-tech walls of SpaceX, there was an unsettling quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed in the corners, casting sterile glows over whiteboards covered in sketches of Mars and designs that pushed the limits of human imagination. The atmosphere was thick, not with the excitement of the next frontier, but with a suffocating tension that no one dared to address. Elon Musk paced through the hallways, his usually confident stride faltering with every step. Today, his demeanor was different, colder. His mind felt like a whirlwind, thoughts spinning into chaos. The world had become a place where every word he said was questioned, every decision analyzed, and every move dissected. He had built an empire, a rocket company that could change humanity's future, but as he walked past the lab tables and engineers working diligently, his heart weighed heavy. For all his success, there was an emptiness inside him that he couldn't escape. There was a sense that the people around him didn't see him, not truly. They saw the CEO, the billionaire visionary, the man who was changing the world. But what was he really? Beneath the carefully constructed public persona, behind the glass windows of his penthouse, who was he? Even now, as he moved through the building, a part of him felt like a ghost, watching his empire from the outside. Elon, you're here. A voice interrupted his thoughts. One of his senior engineers, Dave, was jogging up to him with a nervous but enthusiastic grin. His eyes flickered over Elon's face, his enthusiasm faltering for a split second. "Yeah, I'm here," Elon muttered, his gaze drifting toward the massive window that overlooked the sprawling SpaceX campus. "How's the progress on the Falcon project?" Dave hesitated, glancing at the other engineers who were too busy to notice. "We're getting there, Elon. Just a few tweaks. You know, we're all pushing for the launch in the next few months. Should be smooth sailing." Elon nodded absently, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't sure if he could even trust these people anymore. Not with the whispers he'd been hearing lately. Whispers about how the company was no longer his, how it was being siphoned off by unseen hands. There were murmurs of new leadership, of power shifts, and though he hadn't seen any concrete signs, the doubt gnawed at him. "Good," he said, his voice hollow. "I'll check back later. Keep me updated." As he walked away, a feeling of unease crawled up his spine. He couldn't shake the suspicion that something was off, that there was more to this than just the technical challenges. His empire had always been built on trust, trust in the people who believed in his vision. But lately, he felt as though that foundation was crumbling. The hallways were quieter now, the faint echoes of his footsteps mingling with the hum of machines. The staff moved like automatons, each absorbed in their own work, yet there was an unspoken distance between them. The silence seemed to speak louder than any words could. But it wasn't just SpaceX that was giving him this feeling. It was everything. The people around him, the faces in the crowd, even his own reflection in the mirror. Everything was a lie. His wealth, his fame, the way the world fawned over him. It was all part of a script that had long stopped making sense. And then, there was the matter of his personal life. His relationships, the ones he had once believed were genuine, had grown strained, twisted. Friends had become business partners, family had become strangers. The people who had once called him a genius now only saw a man too distracted, too distant, too caught up in his own vision. The billionaire dream had come with a cost, and that cost was more than just money. It was trust, it was connection, it was his soul. As the day wore on, Elon found himself standing outside the main entrance of SpaceX. The sun was lower in the sky now, and the air had cooled. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the horizon as a deep sense of isolation filled him. This was his life, his reality, and yet it felt as if he were watching someone else live it. A car pulled up, the engine roaring to a stop. He glanced up and saw his bodyguard, Frank, stepping out with his usual stoic expression. Frank gave Elon a small nod, his eyes scanning the surroundings, always alert. "You all right, Elon?" Frank asked, his voice gruff but concerned. Elon didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the pavement, watching the dust swirl in the air. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore." Frank was quiet for a moment before he responded, "Trust is a dangerous thing in this world." Elon's gaze hardened. "That's not what I meant." "I know." Frank's voice softened, almost imperceptibly. "But you're not the only one who feels it. The walls here are closing in. People talk." Elon looked up at him, his eyes sharp. "What do you mean, people talk?" Frank hesitated. "You're not as untouchable as you think, Elon." Elon didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked away, his mind racing. It was all starting to make sense. He had been so focused on pushing forward, on conquering space, that he had overlooked the forces working against him from within. But he had a plan. It was drastic, reckless even, but what else did he have left? He couldn't just stand by and watch his empire slip away. Elon Musk was about to do something no one would ever expect. He was going to become a ghost in his own world, and no one would see it coming. He would disappear, fade into the shadows, become the very thing his company had built its success on, a symbol of rebirth. But not in the way anyone would imagine. He wouldn't be the billionaire mogul with the world at his feet. He would be someone else entirely, someone who could see his empire from the inside out. The homeless man. Elon's plan was set in motion. The world would never expect it, but it was his only chance, his only way to truly understand the depths of betrayal surrounding him, to see if his empire was still his or had already slipped into the hands of others. And so, he began to slip into the shadows, becoming something else, something almost invisible. The first night wasn't as easy as he thought it would be. He had arranged for his bodyguard, Frank, to drop him off a few blocks away from SpaceX headquarters so he could begin his transformation. With only a ragged jacket, dirty jeans, and a beanie to cover his distinctive features, he hoped to disappear into the world. The cold air bit at his skin as he walked through the unfamiliar streets, blending in with the homeless population. But there was no warmth in the city tonight, no comfort. For the first time in years, Elon felt the weight of insignificance. He was no longer the man who had changed the world. He was just another person on the streets, forgotten and ignored. As the days passed, he spent his nights hiding in plain sight, observing his company from the outside. He watched as employees came and went, moving through the doors with efficiency and purpose. But something about the atmosphere unsettled him. There was an undercurrent of anxiety that he hadn't noticed before. The way his employees exchanged glances, the quiet murmurs in the break room. The facade of loyalty was slipping. Elon's interactions with people grew fewer, and soon, he found himself questioning everyone around him. One of his first encounters was with Frank, who had been tasked with checking in on him. As expected, Frank greeted him with an air of concern, masking his suspicion with politeness. "Elon, you okay?" Frank asked, though his eyes scanned the street as if searching for something. Elon gave a cold nod, keeping his voice low. "I'm fine." But the look in Frank's eyes said otherwise. Elon could tell that Frank was hiding something. The loyalty he had once expected from his bodyguard seemed strained now, distant. Frank had always been a man of few words, but there was a crack in his usually stoic exterior. And Elon, being no stranger to manipulation, couldn't help but feel the shift in Frank's behavior. Was he working for someone else? Did he know more than he was letting on? "You know," Frank began, his tone casual but his eyes carefully avoiding Elon's. "The company's been under a lot of pressure. We've got a lot of investors breathing down our necks." Elon paused, studying Frank's words carefully. There was something in the way he spoke, an edge that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just concern. It was something else, something calculated. But Frank was a master at hiding his emotions, and Elon knew he had to tread carefully. "I'm sure," Elon replied, trying to maintain control of the situation. "But we've weathered worse." Frank's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was no warmth in it. Sure we have, he muttered, his eyes shifting away. It was the first sign of doubt. But Elon wasn't ready to confront Frank just yet. There was a bigger game at play, and he needed to understand the full scope of it before he made his next move. The cracks began to deepen, not just with Frank, but within the walls of SpaceX itself. Over the next few days, Elon's observations led him to more unsettling realizations. He overheard hushed conversations between key employees, their voices laced with tension. "We can't keep doing this forever," one of the engineers muttered to another as they passed by the loading docks. "If Musk doesn't step up soon, we'll lose everything." Elon froze in his tracks, hidden in the shadows. He knew the pressure of running a company, but the words sent a shiver down his spine. Lose everything? He had built this company from the ground up. Was it really slipping away? Another conversation caught his ear as he wandered through the side streets near the building. This time, it was two executives, their faces tense, but one of them, Jason, was visibly more agitated than the other. "If we don't push for a leadership change soon, we'll all be out of a job," Jason was saying. "Musk has lost it. His vision's clouded, and the board's not happy with the direction anymore." Elon's stomach churned. A leadership change? That wasn't supposed to happen. This was his company, his vision. The thought of someone else taking the reins made his blood run cold. He needed answers, but he couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. So, he took a different approach. He turned to the people closest to him, the ones who had once called him a friend, a mentor, his old colleagues, the ones who had been there when SpaceX first took flight. He ran into Maria one afternoon, a former senior engineer who had helped shape some of SpaceX's most critical designs. She didn't recognize him immediately, but her expression softened when she saw him sitting on the bench near the main entrance. It had been years since their last conversation, but something in her eyes flickered, a mix of concern and, oddly, fear. "Elon," she said softly, her voice hesitant. He looked up at her, his face unreadable. "You look surprised to see me." "I didn't think I'd see you out here like this," Maria said, a strange hesitation in her voice. "Are you all right?" For a moment, he just stared at her. The old Elon would have made a joke or given a confident smile, but today, he was just a man in hiding. He could feel the tension building between them, like there were unspoken words hanging in the air. "I'm fine," he said finally, though his tone was distant. "Just checking in. I've heard things." Maria's face stiffened at the mention of rumors. "What kind of things?" "Things about the company," Elon replied, his voice low but sharp. "Things I didn't know were happening under the surface." She glanced around quickly, as though ensuring no one was listening, before sitting down beside him. "You need to be careful," she whispered urgently. "There's talk of a takeover, of people making moves behind your back. The board's been having meetings without you. They think you're losing touch with reality, that you're obsessed with Mars and forget about what's happening here." Elon's pulse quickened. He had known, deep down, that something was off, but hearing it confirmed. He felt a hot surge of betrayal rise in his chest. "They're trying to push me out?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to believe it. Maria looked around again, her gaze darting nervously. "It's more than that. They're already making plans, Elon. You're no longer the one calling the shots. They're working behind your back." The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about his company anymore. This was about his entire existence. Everything he had worked for, falling apart. He had trusted these people, believed in them, and now they were the ones slowly unraveling everything he had built. He stood up abruptly, his mind racing. "I'll take care of it," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he believed himself. The pieces of his empire were slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As he walked away, he could feel the walls closing in on him. The world he had once controlled, the world that had revolved around his vision, was now a machine with its own agenda, and he was no longer at the helm. The night was darker than usual, the air thick with tension. It had been days since Elon had fully submerged himself into the shadows, his identity now more a facade than a reality. He wandered the streets, his mind a turbulent storm of confusion and anger. Every time he thought he could get a grip on the chaos unraveling around him, another piece of his world slipped away. The whispers had only gotten louder, the betrayal closer, and now he was poised to discover the full extent of it all. It had started with Maria's warning, a vague but pressing fear that something was happening beneath the surface. But what she hadn't told him was the full scope of it. He didn't know how deep it went, but the signs were all there. The board, the silent meetings, the shift in power that had already begun without him. He had spent countless hours walking the streets near SpaceX, gathering pieces of the puzzle. But now, it was time for the final confrontation. He stood now, hidden in the shadows near the main entrance, watching the people he once trusted filing in and out of the building. The security guards were casual, their attention diverted. Elon's heart raced. His eyes narrowed as the door swung open and he saw Frank stepping through, his face grim. The bodyguard was supposed to be his protector, the one person who stood by him through thick and thin. But Frank wasn't here to protect him tonight. Elon's breath hitched, and a shiver ran down his spine. Frank hadn't just been part of the plan. He was the plan, the key figure in a scheme that Elon hadn't seen coming. The sound of footsteps behind him made him jump. He turned to find Maria standing in the shadows, her eyes wide with fear. She took a step toward him, her voice shaking. "Elon, you have to get out of here. It's happening. They've already started." His heart hammered in his chest as he stared at her. "What do you mean?" His voice was hoarse, disbelief fighting to take hold of him. "What's happening? What have they done?" Maria's lips trembled, her face pale. She didn't have to say anything else. The weight of her silence spoke volumes. Then, in a flash, it hit him. The truth, the cold realization that had been creeping up on him all along. The board, Frank, the people who had once stood by him, they weren't just talking behind his back. They were making their move. And Frank wasn't just a bodyguard. He was in on it. He was the one who had been feeding information to the enemy. He was the one who had betrayed him. "I tried to warn you," Maria whispered, her eyes filled with regret. "But they were too powerful. They had everything on you. Your secrets, your weakness." Elon couldn't process her words fast enough. His mind spun, racing to keep up with the enormity of the situation. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. This wasn't just about power. It was about trust, about the years he had spent building relationships that had all been lies. The people he had called friends had been working behind his back, planning his downfall, ready to take everything he had built. Before he could react, he heard it. Loud voices coming from inside the building, the sound of heavy footsteps approaching fast. Frank, leading the charge. Elon's pulse quickened, panic creeping into his chest. The fight-or-flight instinct surged within him, but there was nowhere to run. This was it. This was the moment everything would change. His gaze shot to Maria, and he saw the hesitation in her eyes, the regret that she hadn't been able to stop it. She had been a part of the plan, too, hadn't she? Had she betrayed him as well? But no, there was something in her face that suggested she hadn't known the full extent of what was happening. She had been a pawn, just like him. "I'm sorry, Elon," she whispered again, the words filled with pain. "I never wanted this." But it was too late for apologies. Elon turned on his heel, his legs carrying him into the darkness. He couldn't stay here, not when he was already this close to the truth. The sounds of footsteps grew louder, closer. Frank's voice rang out in the night, calling his name. "Elon, stop. Don't make this worse." But Elon didn't stop. He couldn't. His mind was too clouded with rage and confusion. He needed answers. He needed to confront Frank, to rip the mask off of the man who had been by his side for years. He couldn't let them win. Not yet. He ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the shadows swallowed him whole. But the sound of chasing footsteps kept growing louder, the distant hum of a car engine mixing with the pounding in his chest. He pushed forward, not knowing where he was going, just desperate to escape. But as he rounded the corner, he was met with the cold barrel of a gun pressed to his chest. Frank's voice was low, almost sorrowful. "You didn't think it would end like this, did you?" Elon froze. The world slowed to a crawl as he locked eyes with his former bodyguard. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He couldn't wrap his mind around the situation. Frank, the man he had trusted, the one who had vowed to protect him, was now his enemy. "I should have known," Elon muttered, his voice barely audible. I trusted you. Frank's expression softened, a moment of hesitation passing over him. But then it was gone. It was never personal, Elon. It's business. You were too focused on Mars, too focused on the future, to see what was happening right in front of you. Elon's heart skipped a beat. You've been planning this all along. Frank nodded slowly. They promised me everything. Power, control, money. All I had to do was keep you distracted while they took over. The words hit Elon like a punch to the gut. His empire, the very thing he had built with his blood, sweat, and vision, had been taken from him without a second thought. And the worst part was, it wasn't even just about the company. It was about his entire existence, his identity. They had stolen his life from him. You were never really on my side, Elon whispered, his voice trembling with betrayal. I was never on anyone's side, Frank replied coldly, except my own. In that moment, time seemed to stretch infinitely. Elon stood there, staring at Frank, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He had trusted this man, had believed in him, and now everything was gone. The life he had fought so hard to create had slipped through his fingers like sand. The gun pressed harder into his chest. Frank's eyes darkened as he slowly started to speak again. Now, you're going to walk away. You'll leave SpaceX, disappear, and never return. Understand? Elon's pulse pounded in his ears. This was it, the choice that would define everything. There was no going back. If he wanted to survive this, if he wanted to take back what was his, he needed to make a decision. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. I'll never walk away. A fire ignited inside him. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. In that instant, as the betrayal settled in, Elon Musk made a decision that would change everything. The night had been long, but the dawn brought no clarity. Elon's world had been irrevocably altered, and as the morning light spilled through the cracks in the dim alleyway where he hid, it felt like the weight of his empire had already begun to crumble. Frank's words still echoed in his mind. Those cold, calculated words that shattered everything he had known. You were too focused on Mars. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about survival. He couldn't escape the flood of thoughts that hit him in waves. Frank had been a part of his life for so long, trusted more than anyone else. He had given him everything, only to be betrayed in the cruelest way possible. His stomach churned with nausea as the reality set in. He had lost more than his company. He had lost the people closest to him, the people who had fed him the lie of loyalty, of friendship. They had sold him out, and he couldn't even blame them. They had been consumed by their own desires, just like him. But still, the betrayal burned. For the next few days, Elon moved in a haze, his mind numb to everything around him. The once proud man who had made history with his vision and ambition was now a shadow, lost in a world of uncertainty. He avoided contact with the outside world, retreating into the darkness, away from the prying eyes of the media and his remaining colleagues. He had known that success often came with its price, but never had he imagined the cost would be this high. It wasn't just the loss of SpaceX. It was the loss of himself. Meanwhile, the world around him seemed to buzz with chaos. News outlets were scrambling to report on the sudden disappearance of Elon Musk, leaving a void that only fueled the speculation. Whispers filled the air about his mental state, his erratic behavior, and the possibility that the genius who had led the charge for private space exploration had finally cracked. Was he really the man they thought he was? The headlines screamed. Had his vision been just another delusion? The media painted him as a man on the brink of insanity, a fallen idol. They speculated on his mental health, on his obsession with Mars, and how it had led to his downfall. And the more they wrote, the more the public began to turn on him. The world that had once praised his genius was now filled with judgment, and with it came an overwhelming sense of guilt. Elon's name was dragged through the mud, his credibility questioned by people who had once heralded him as a hero. His own family, too, seemed to drift further away. They had already distanced themselves from his more controversial ideas, but now, with his reputation in tatters, they began to fall silent. Elon sat alone in a small apartment, the harsh light of the television flickering in the corner. His once brilliant mind now felt clouded with shame. He watched as images of his company, his life's work, were paraded before the public, a reminder of how it had all slipped through his fingers. He had built something that was meant to change the world, and now it was crumbling, just like everything else he had ever touched. His family had not reached out. His mother, once his biggest supporter, hadn't called. His brother, who had always been a steady hand in the chaos of his life, seemed to have distanced himself. The silence between them grew louder each day. The fractured relationships, the broken trust, they all weighed on him. It was a crushing loneliness that engulfed him in the aftermath of the betrayal. But amid the turmoil, there was one thing that continued to burn inside him: anger. The rage at what had been taken from him. And it wasn't just his company. It was his identity, his reputation, the very essence of who he had been. The people who had called him friend had been his downfall, and the people who had praised him had now cast him aside. The ones who had worshipped his ambition now mocked his fall. But amidst the guilt, the sense of loss, there was something else. A lingering feeling of emboldenment. Elon couldn't deny it. His anger was a fire, and it burned hotter with each passing day. Frank, Maria, the board, they had taken everything from him, but they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated his drive. They had underestimated his hunger for control. Elon's thoughts began to shift. The idea of running away, of fading into obscurity, had been tempting at first. The idea of disappearing forever seemed like the only escape from the madness that had consumed him. But no, he couldn't. He wouldn't let it end like this. He had never been one to give up. And now, more than ever, he realized that he had a chance to take it all back. Not just the company. No, that was only a piece of the puzzle. What he had to reclaim was his life, his future. In the weeks that followed, Elon began to work in silence, behind closed doors. The world had turned its back on him, and in a way, it was freeing. No longer did he have to live up to the impossible expectations of the world. No longer did he have to be the genius everyone wanted him to be. The pressure that had once defined him now felt like a weight he no longer had to carry. But there was still a price to pay. The fallout from the betrayal continued to ripple outwards. SpaceX was no longer his. The board had taken control, and there were whispers of a new CEO being put in place. Jason, the executive who had once been loyal, was now positioned as the face of the company. His name was already being splashed across headlines as the one to lead SpaceX into its next phase. But the media didn't stop there. They speculated on every aspect of Elon's life, from his personal relationships to his mental health. The public devoured every detail. They made him a cautionary tale, a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition, a man who reached for the stars and lost everything in the process. Elon's emotional toll was deep. The days blurred together, and the exhaustion weighed on him like an anchor. He had been betrayed by the people he trusted, and now he was the subject of global ridicule. The public had turned him into a villain, and in some ways, they were right. He had become a shadow of the man he once was. The weight of his failures, his decisions, and the manipulation he had once been part of had destroyed him. But amid all of this, he began to rebuild. It wasn't just about SpaceX anymore. It wasn't even about redemption. It was about something deeper, something more personal, his own journey, his own survival. It wasn't about winning back the title of genius or regaining the public's favor. It was about learning who he truly was in the face of everything he had lost. And as he worked in the silence of his small apartment, putting the pieces back together, one thing became clear. He would never let anyone control his fate again. The betrayals had taught him too much. He had been broken, yes, but he wasn't finished. Months had passed since Elon Musk had vanished from the public eye, and the dust had begun to settle. The world had moved on, as it always did, from one scandal to the next. But the ripples of the events surrounding Elon's downfall still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. The fall of an icon, a visionary whose name had been synonymous with innovation and progress, had sent shockwaves through the world. But now, after all the chaos, the questions remained. What would become of Elon? And what would become of the people who had betrayed him? Frank's life had taken a turn, but not in the way he had imagined. His allegiance to the board and his role in betraying Elon had seemed like a calculated decision, one that would bring him power and wealth. But the reality of what he had done slowly crept up on him. Frank had no peace. The betrayal, the deceit, it weighed on him like 1,000 pounds. He had never truly believed in the vision of SpaceX, but he had believed in Elon. And now, in the aftermath, Frank found himself lost in a void of his own making. No amount of money or power could erase the guilt he carried. Maria, too, was left to deal with the aftermath. She had tried to warn Elon, to prevent the disaster, but in the end, she had been swept up in the currents of the betrayal herself. The emotional toll was impossible to ignore. Every day, she wrestled with regret, with the knowledge that she had been part of the scheme that had torn a man apart. She sought redemption, but it was a fleeting hope. The damage had been done, and no apology could fix what she had taken part in. She had been used, but she had also allowed herself to be complicit. Redemption, it seemed, was a distant dream. Jason, the new face of SpaceX, had risen to power with an air of confidence, almost arrogance. He had taken the reins of a company that had once belonged to Elon, but now it was his. The media hailed him as the man to lead the company into its next phase, but beneath the surface, he too felt the pressure of the blood on his hands. He had been part of the conspiracy, part of the silent coup that had pushed Elon aside. No matter how much success he achieved, no matter how many accolades came his way, Jason couldn't escape the fact that he had played a role in destroying the very thing he had once admired. But what of Elon? His journey had been a strange one. It had taken him to the depths of despair, to the very edge of his own existence. The betrayal had shattered him, but it had also made him stronger. In the months that followed, he had found a strange kind of clarity, a quiet resolve that had driven him to rebuild, not just his empire, but himself. Elon Musk had once believed that his power was rooted in his achievements, his company, his ambition. But now, he understood that his true power lay in his ability to rise, to face the darkness and rebuild from the wreckage. He didn't return to SpaceX, not in the way people expected. He didn't seek revenge, nor did he try to reclaim what he had lost. Instead, he quietly re-entered the world, taking on new projects, new challenges, things that didn't define him by the weight of others' expectations. He had learned, painfully, that no one could truly define him but himself. His worth wasn't tied to SpaceX, to Tesla, or even to Mars. It was tied to something deeper, something far more personal. As the years passed, the media's obsession with his downfall began to fade. New stories emerged, new names took center stage, and Elon Musk became a distant memory for the world. But for those who had known him, those who had been part of the betrayal, his absence haunted them. They lived in the shadow of what they had done, and no amount of success or power could erase the truth. They had destroyed the very thing they had once admired, and in the end, that was their true downfall. The world had moved on, but the lessons remained. Power, ambition, and trust. These were fragile things. They could build empires or tear them down in an instant. The betrayal that had rocked Elon Musk's world had shown that the very people who had once been his closest allies could so easily turn on him. In the end, it wasn't about the wealth or the success. It was about trust. It was about the people who stood beside you when everything else fell apart. And Elon had learned, too late, that not all the people who stood beside him were there for the right reasons. As for Frank, Maria, and Jason, they each lived in the aftermath of their decisions. Some of them tried to justify their actions, while others were consumed by guilt. But in the end, there was no redemption for them. Their fates were sealed by their choices, and the world continued on, indifferent to the lives of those who had once been its shining stars. The final lesson, the one that Elon had learned through the darkest period of his life, was this: trust was a fragile thing. It was a gift that could be given, but not always reciprocated. And the people who you thought would always have your back could easily be the ones to betray you. But there was always a way forward. No matter how much had been taken from him, Elon Musk found his path again. He found the strength to rebuild, not just his career, but his life, his sense of self. In the end, he had nothing left to prove. He had been brought to the brink of destruction, but he had found his way back from it. And as he stood at the edge of the world he had built, he realized something simple but profound. The true measure of a person was not in their triumphs, but in their ability to rise after the fall.